The most dangerous predators in this world do not hide in dark alleys. They do not lurk in shadows or announce themselves with warning signs that give you time to run. The most dangerous ones smile at you across the breakfast table. They pass you the butter. They ask if you slept well. They sit beside you at doctor's appointments and hold your hand and say all the right things. And you feel in those moments genuinely loved, genuinely safe, genuinely held by people who would never wish you harm. And sometimes that feeling is the most lethal thing of all. Today, I want to tell you the story of Elena Marsh, a woman who was, by any external measure, living the life that people spend their whole lives trying to build. And the story of the morning she looked across a kitchen table and saw, in the space of a single unguarded second, the truth that had been sitting there all along, and what she did with it. Let me start with the version of Elena's life that she believed in, because that version matters. It matters because the gap between the life she thought she had and the life she actually had is the architecture of everything that follows. Elena was 34 years old and had come into the marriage with what her family's attorneys had always called, in the language of estate planning, a substantial trust. Her grandfather had built a real estate company in the Pacific Northwest over 40 years, the kind of company that starts as one man's determination and ends as a family's enduring legacy. And when he died, he had left the bulk of it in a trust that would pass to Elena on her 35th birthday. The value of that trust, at the time this story begins, was just over $11 million. She had not built this wealth. She had simply been born into a family that had, and she held it with the particular combination of gratitude and mild discomfort that people sometimes feel about inherited things, aware of the luck involved, aware of the responsibility, not inclined to make it the center of her identity. She worked. She had spent her late 20s and early 30s building a small interior design business that was genuinely hers, that paid its own bills, that had nothing to do with her grandfather's company or her family's name. This mattered to her. The work mattered to her in a specific way that the trust never quite did. She had met David 4 years earlier at a charity auction. He was handsome in the reliable way of men who have always been handsome and have incorporated that fact into how they move through the world. Financially comfortable from his own career in commercial real estate, easy and charming in conversation. He had pursued her with a consistency that she found, at the time, romantic. In retrospect, she would understand it as something else. But at the time, it felt like being chosen. And being chosen by someone like David felt like confirmation of something she hadn't quite known she needed confirmed. They married 2 years after they met. It was a good wedding, the kind where the photographs are easy because the subjects are genuinely happy. Elena was genuinely happy. She had no reason not to be. Margaret arrived in Elena's life as the mother-in-law that, if you described her to someone, would sound almost too good to be true. Warm, attentive, the kind of woman who remembered things, the name of Elena's college roommate, the exact flavor of the birthday cake Elena had mentioned preferring, the way Elena took her coffee. She had the gift of making you feel attended to, which is a gift that looks like love, and sometimes is something else entirely. And the difference between the two is very difficult to detect from the inside. When Elena discovered she was pregnant, 11 weeks along, a Tuesday morning in October, the test sitting on the bathroom counter, her hands not quite steady, the first person she called, before her mother, before her closest friend, was David. And David's response was everything she could have hoped for. The joy in his voice was real, or seemed real, and she held on to that for a very long time afterward. Margaret moved in the following week. It was framed as help, as the natural thing, as what families do. She would cook, she said. She would handle some of the household management while Elena navigated the early weeks of pregnancy. She would be there. And she was there. She was constantly, warmly, attentively there. The tea began in the second week. It arrived every morning with a quality of ceremony that Margaret gave to things she considered important. A particular cup, always the same one, white with small blue flowers along the rim, filled with something that was dark in color and carried a scent that Elena found difficult to describe. Not unpleasant exactly, but distinctive. herbal in a way that was more medicinal than pleasant. Margaret called it a family recipe, something passed down through generations, something that every woman in her family had drunk through every pregnancy. It was for the baby, she said. It was for strength. It was the old way of doing things, before vitamins came in bottles and doctors told you what everything should taste like. Elena drank it. Of course she drank it. She was pregnant and mildly anxious and surrounded by people who presented themselves as caring, and the tea was offered with such genuine warmth, such consistent maternal love, that declining it would have felt like a small rejection of all of that. She drank it because that is what people do when they are in the middle of trusting someone. They accept the cup. The sickness began in the 3rd week. Not the ordinary sickness of early pregnancy, which Elena had already experienced and had already made her accommodations with. This was different in quality, more severe, more persistent, arriving not in the predictable waves that most pregnant women navigate, but in a steady, grinding deterioration that left her exhausted in a way that sleep did not resolve. Her doctor attributed it to a difficult first trimester. Elena attributed it to a difficult first trimester. There was nothing at that point that pointed anywhere else. But the body knows things before the mind does. It keeps its own accounting, runs its own diagnostics, sends signals that the conscious mind is not always willing to receive. And Elena's body had been sending signals for weeks, small, insistent communications that she had been interpreting through the framework of pregnancy and adjusting for accordingly, when what they were actually communicating was something else entirely. It was a Tuesday morning in November. She was in the kitchen, the cup of tea in front of her, Margaret moving efficiently around the space behind her. David was at the counter, checking his phone. It was an ordinary morning in every visible way. And then Margaret said something to David. Elena didn't catch the words, only the tone, and David looked up from his phone and something passed between their faces. She had no better word for it than cold. Not the cold of a difficult relationship or a tense household, but the cold of something deliberate, something shared, something that had existed long before this morning and would exist after it. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and then Margaret was warm again, and David was warm again, and the morning was ordinary again. But Elena had seen it. She did not react. This is the part of the story that I find, in retrospect, the most remarkable. Not what she found, not what she did about it, but the quality of her response in that moment. She did not panic. She did not confront. She looked at the cup of tea in front of her, and she looked at the window, and she did not drink the tea. She poured it, slowly and carefully, into the stainless steel travel thermos she kept on the counter for her morning commute. She did this while making a comment about needing to get ready, about being behind schedule. She capped the thermos. She smiled. She kissed David on the cheek and told Margaret the tea smelled wonderful as always, and she went upstairs. She did not know in that moment what she was going to find. She only knew that something had passed across that kitchen like a cold current, and that she was pregnant, and that the instinct operating in her was not the instinct of a frightened woman, but the instinct of something older and more fundamental than fear. The instinct of a mother protecting what is hers. She took the thermos to an independent medical testing laboratory the following morning, telling David she had a design client consultation. She dropped off the sample and paid for an expedited analysis. She drove home. She made dinner. She sat at the table with her husband and her mother-in-law, and she was warm, and she was present, and she gave nothing away. The laboratory called her cell phone on a Thursday afternoon, while David was at work and Margaret was in the garden. She sat in the car in the driveway to take the call because she understood that she should not be inside the house for whatever she was about to hear. The woman from the lab was professional and calm and very specific. The sample contained identifiable concentrations of 2 substances. The first was pennyroyal, a plant-derived compound with a long documented history of use in inducing miscarriage, toxic to the developing fetus at the concentrations present. The second was a compound associated with cumulative liver and kidney toxicity in adults, the effects of which would not be acute but would accumulate over time, the timeline dependent on dose and frequency. Elena sat in the car for 45 minutes after the call ended. She did not cry. She would cry later, much later, when the full architecture of it had been assembled and she was somewhere safe and alone and had given herself permission to feel the full weight of what had been done to her. But in the car in the driveway on that Thursday afternoon, what she felt was a kind of absolute clarity that she had never felt before. The specific, terrible clarity of understanding exactly what is happening to you and exactly who is doing it. She went inside. Margaret was making tea. Elena thanked her and said she was going to lie down. That evening, after David fell asleep, she opened his laptop. She had known his password for 3 years. She had set it up for him once when he'd forgotten it, and he had never changed it, because people who are confident in their deceptions are not always attentive to their operational security. The email folder was not hidden. The messages went back 14 months. The woman's name was Christine. She was 31 years old and worked at a property management firm in the same professional world David occupied, and the messages between them were extensive and detailed and covered a great deal of ground. The early messages were the ordinary communications of an affair, the logistics of secrecy, the language of infatuation, the specific tenderness that people in illicit relationships develop in the compressed private space they inhabit. But the later messages were different. They were different because they were not about love or desire or the complications of an ongoing affair. They were about money. They were about Elena's trust, which would transfer on her 35th birthday, 4 months away. They were about the fact that a contested divorce, initiated before that transfer date, would be complicated and expensive and uncertain in its outcome. They were about the baby, which was described in terms that Elena sat with for a long time in the dark, terms she will carry for the rest of her life. And they were about Margaret, who had apparently been the architect of the tea, who had knowledge of certain traditional herbal preparations, who had introduced the idea, who had been the practical instrument of what they had collectively decided was the most efficient path to the outcome they wanted. The outcome they wanted was for Elena to lose the baby, for Elena's health to deteriorate slowly enough to be attributed to other causes, and for David to be the grieving widower in possession of an $11 million trust. Elena closed the laptop. She walked to the bathroom. She ran the water and stood at the sink for a while, looking at the face in the mirror, and she made a decision about who that face was going to be for what came next. She did not confront David. She did not confront Margaret. She did not call anyone that night, or the next day, or the day after that. She continued to drink the tea, or to appear to, which is a different thing, because from the morning after the phone call, she had been pouring it into the thermos and disposing of it at a gas station 2 miles from the house. She sat at the table and she smiled, and she was the Elena that David and Margaret expected her to be. And behind that face, she was building something entirely different. She called a lawyer on a Monday morning from a coffee shop downtown. Not her family's estate attorneys, who knew David and whose first instinct might be to manage the situation. A different lawyer, a woman who had spent 20 years in family law with a specialization in financial fraud within marriage, who had a reputation that was not warm but was very effective, and who, when Elena laid out what she had in a 2-hour meeting, became very still and very precise and said, "We need to move carefully and completely." She hired a private investigation firm the same week. They had experience with exactly this category of situation and came with documentation protocols that Elena found reassuring in their thoroughness. The hidden cameras were small and unremarkable and took 3 days to install in ways that required Elena to have Margaret and David out of the house for specific windows of time, which she accomplished by manufacturing appointments and errands. She began planning the party. It was framed, to David and Margaret and everyone in their social world, as a gender reveal. Elena had always wanted something meaningful for this moment, she said. something that brought the people they loved together. David was supportive, as David always was, about visible gestures of family life that cost him nothing and created the public impression of a happy marriage. Margaret helped with the guest list. Elena invited everyone: David's extended family, his professional colleagues, the people from their social circle who had attended their wedding and their dinner parties, and the various performances of their life together over 4 years. She also arranged for a catering company to handle the food and service. She had certain specific requirements about staffing. The party was on a Saturday in December. The estate looked exactly as a successful, joyful celebration should look. Flowers, lights, a catering staff in matching uniforms, a bar set up near the garden, tables covered in the pale yellow of a party that has not yet revealed its secret. 112 guests arrived over the course of an hour. The atmosphere was warm and celebratory in the particular way of events where everyone present expects something happy to happen. Elena moved through it with the ease of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment for weeks and has made her peace with what it is going to require. She greeted people, she accepted congratulations about the pregnancy, she stood with David in the receiving area and smiled at his colleagues and at his aunt who had traveled from out of state, and at the various people who made up the public surface of their life. And David was charming and attentive and everything he always was in public. And Margaret was warm and proud in the background. And it was, for anyone watching, a perfect afternoon. The table at the center of the garden held the cake, a beautiful cake, white with gold detail, the kind that appears in the photographs people take of these events, and post online with captions about joy and new beginnings. Above the garden, mounted to the house's exterior wall, was a large screen that Elena had arranged ostensibly to display a slideshow of family photographs before the gender reveal. Elena took the microphone just after 4 o'clock. The crowd settled. David moved to stand beside her, hand at her back, the picture of a supportive husband at a happy family celebration. She thanked everyone for coming. She said that this baby had already changed her life in ways she hadn't anticipated, and that was true. She said that the experience of this pregnancy had taught her things about herself and about the people around her that she would carry forever, and that was also true. She said she had prepared something to share before they cut the cake. She pressed the button on the remote in her hand. The screen lit up. The first thing it displayed was the laboratory report. The full document, formatted clearly, with the 2 compounds identified and their concentrations noted. For a moment, the crowd read it with the polite, confused attention of people who have been shown something they do not yet have a framework for. Then the footage began. It was not long, 8 minutes of video from the kitchen of the house, showing Margaret at the counter on 3 separate mornings, adding substances to the tea that was prepared for Elena, adding them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, who knew exactly how much and where in the preparation process, and how to ensure the cup would be ready by the time Elena came downstairs. The crowd was very quiet. The final portion of the screen showed the messages. Not all of them. There were too many, and Elena had selected carefully, working with her attorney to identify the ones that were clearest in their intent and most unambiguous in what they established. The ones where the baby was discussed. The ones where the trust was calculated. The ones where Margaret's role was acknowledged and coordinated. The ones that, taken together, left no room for the interpretation that this was anything other than what it was. David was standing beside her when it began. She felt him go still, the particular stillness of a man whose brain is processing options faster than his face can maintain its expression. Margaret was near the back of the crowd. Elena had noted her position earlier. The crowd was not quiet anymore. It was the sound of people absorbing something that does not fit into their categories. The sound of a social situation reorganizing itself around a reality that no one in attendance had arrived expecting. Some people stepped back from David and Margaret in the instinctive physical grammar of disassociation. Some people looked at Elena with an expression that she recognized, from across the lawn, as something close to awe. David reached for Elena's arm. She stepped aside without looking at him. Margaret began moving toward the garden's side entrance, the movement of someone who has identified an exit. The police had been waiting at the front of the property since 3:30. Two officers in plain clothes who had received, the previous week, a full package of evidence prepared by Elena's attorney in coordination with the investigating firm, the lab report, the video footage, the communications, and a detailed written account of the timeline and methodology, everything organized with the precision of someone who had understood from the beginning that this moment needed to be unambiguous. They came through the garden gate at 4:14. David and Margaret were arrested at Elena's gender reveal party in front of 112 people on a Saturday afternoon in December. The charges included conspiracy to cause a miscarriage, poisoning, and conspiracy to commit fraud in connection with the trust. The evidence was thorough. Their attorneys would spend the following months doing what attorneys do with thorough evidence, which is look for the places where it might be thinner, and find very few. The divorce was completed 8 months later. Elena's attorney had filed for divorce on the morning of the party. The papers served as part of a coordinated sequence that left David in a position where the legal proceedings and the criminal investigation were simultaneous and mutually reinforcing. The financial settlement, given the documented fraud and the nature of the conspiracy, was not a negotiated division of marital assets. It was a reckoning. Elena left with what was hers, all of it. The baby was born the following spring, healthy, early by 2 weeks, delivered in a hospital where Elena had the entire floor to herself and every doctor she asked for, and her mother beside her and her closest friend, and none of the people who had spent months trying to prevent this moment anywhere near it. She named her daughter something that means protected. I won't tell you the exact name because some things belong to the people in the story and not to the people who hear it. I want to say something before I leave you with this. There is a version of the story of betrayal that ends with the betrayed person diminished, with them smaller than they were before, more afraid, more cautious, with a permanent scar in the place where the trust used to be. That version is real. That version happens. And it would be dishonest to tell the other version without acknowledging that this one exists. But there is also a version where something else happens, where the betrayal, instead of diminishing the person it was intended to destroy, does something that the people who planned it never calculated for. Where the person who was supposed to be weakened by what was done to them is instead clarified by it. Where the effort to reduce someone to nothing instead strips away everything that was not essential and leaves behind something that is very hard, very clear, and very difficult to threaten. Elena did not become harder after what happened to her. She became more precise, more deliberate, more aware of the specific weight of trust and what it costs and what it is worth. She had been a good person before the kitchen and the tea and the cold look across the table. She remained a good person after, but she was a different kind of good, the kind that has been tested and knows what it is made of and does not need to wonder anymore. The people who tried to unmake her are in prison. The child they tried to prevent from existing is alive. The money they tried to take is intact. And Elena is raising her daughter in a house where the tea is made by her own hands, in a cup she has chosen, from ingredients she has selected herself. True strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is not the refusal to trust or the armor of never letting anyone close enough to hurt you. True strength is what remains when someone has done their worst to you, and it was not enough. It is the moment in the driveway when you sit in the car with the phone in your hand and you decide, in absolute clarity, what happens next. It is the ability to smile across a breakfast table at the people who are trying to destroy you, and pour the tea into the thermos, and drive to the laboratory, and build the case, and wait. And when the moment comes, the moment you have been preparing for while they were still congratulating themselves on how clever they were, to press the button and let the screen speak for itself.